Linda's here as well. So I'll go ahead and get started. It is 9:59, which I feel like is close enough. So we'll get started, and anyone who joins afterwards, they can just catch up, right? So today we're going to be talking about anxiety and unhealthy thinking patterns. And the reason why I think this is a great topic to discuss is because I think the better we know ourselves, the better we're going to be able to catch some of these unhealthy patterns, and the better we're going to be able to figure out how to respond rather than react. And I know when you're in a high stress, high anxiety situation like caregiving, where it really is taking 100% of your effort, 100% of your time, 100% of your emotions a lot of the times. If we have these anxieties or unhealthy thinking patterns, it's very easy for us to be kind of pushed over that edge. And I'm just speaking from personal experience here. And the best way that we can curb behaviors is to understand the behaviors. And so today is going to be a lot of information. I have several slides. So I hope I don't go too fast. And I hope that if you have any questions you feel comfortable asking, either you can raise your hand, unmute, or just put something in the chat, and I'll get to them as soon as I can. Good morning, George. Good morning, Suzanne. So glad you were here with us today.
Morning. Good morning.
Yes.
Good morning.
We are about to officially get started. And for those of you who have not done so, I would really appreciate if you would put your email address in the chat box so that I can send you a follow-up survey and just get a good idea of your feedback and how well this presentation served you. And of course, give you space to give me any type of suggestions on future topics that you would like to know more about, okay? So we'll go ahead and get started with anxiety and unhealthy thinking patterns. And you may find some of these patterns in yourself, right? But you also might find them in the ones that you're caring for. And so if you start seeing some of these signs or these patterns come up in people that you're caring for, you can recognize it as anxiety and maybe not take it personally if maybe reactions are a little high. I know for me, education is the best way for me to cultivate compassion, not only for others, but for myself. And I think that's very key when we're doing this job. We have to be compassionate towards ourselves as well and not beat ourselves up all the time when we don't do things the way that we think we should do them. But we'll talk about shoulds later on. I'll go ahead and get started. So our agenda today is we're going to go over some mental health statistics because I think it's important to know how prevalent anxiety disorders are, and makes you feel maybe not as alone. And maybe makes you feel like if you need to reach out for help, you can, because it's not that uncommon. We're going to talk about some mental and behavioral symptoms of anxiety. Sometimes you might not even know that's what you're experiencing. So we'll go over some of those symptoms. Also the physical symptoms of anxiety. We're going to discuss briefly the top anxiety disorders by prevalence throughout the United States and globally, which would be generalized anxiety disorder, social anxiety disorder, and different major types of anxiety and some more facts. Then we're going to break down, most of our presentation today is going to be over cognitive distortions, and we're going to talk about how we can change those and some tips for stress busting. So I'm going to start off with the World Health Organization, or WHO, the definition of health. And they say that health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. There's a lot of people out there without disease or infirmity, but they are not mentally healthy, they're not physically healthy, and they're not socially healthy, okay? So because mental health is essential to overall health and well-being, it should be recognized and treated in all Americans, including older adults and their caregivers, with the same urgency as physical health. I'm sure you've heard the comparison of, if you've got a broken arm, you go to the doctor, right? If you have diabetes, you take your insulin, right? Mental health is no different than any other physical health issue that you may face. And so we need to destigmatize the use of therapies and professionals that can help us with these things, just like you would go to a doctor or a dentist or whatever to, focus on your physical body. So, did you know that anxiety disorders are the most common mental illness in the United States, affecting 40 million adults? That's over 9% of the population, and that's over the age of 18 or older. And I don't want you to get hung up on the phrasing of mental illness, because I know if you're my age or older, the term mental illness brings all sorts of, stereotypical type image in your mind about the type of person who has a mental illness. But anxiety, an anxiety disorder is considered a mental illness, and it doesn't mean that you're quote unquote crazy or you're unstable. Okay, that's just the terminology we use, but it's not as scary as it might sound. And globally, 1 in 13 people suffer from anxiety. And anxiety disorders are the most common mental illness globally. And I want you to think about anxiety as a response of your nervous system. If you've been in any of my trainings before, I do talk about the nervous system and how anxiety is really there to serve a purpose. It's there to keep us safe, to warn us about unsafe situations. But sometimes that system can be overactive. Sometimes that system can be off a little bit. And so some of these anxiety disorders stem from just an overactive nervous system. And it's not necessarily anything other than that, right? Right. So the annual prevalence among US adults by condition, anxiety disorders, we just talked about, 48 million people, that's 19.1% of the population. Major depressive episode, 8.3%, that's 21 million people. Post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD, that's 9 million people. Bipolar disorder, 7 million people. Borderline personality disorder or BPD, that's 3.5 million people. Obsessive compulsive disorder or OCD, that's 3 million people. And schizophrenia is less than 1% of the population with 1.5 million. So you can see here, there are just in the United States alone, millions of people who have experiences with anxiety disorders and cognitive distortions and things like that. So it's really, really not an uncommon scenario to have an anxiety disorder. And so I hope by seeing these numbers, it'll help kind of melt that stigma away, so that if you find that you might need some help, if you might need some professional support, you are not alone, right? A lot of us, myself included, have anxiety disorders, okay? So here's some mental and behavioral symptoms of anxiety. So of course, this is not an exhaustive list. These are just some of the more common ones that people experience. So obsessive thoughts, reactions that are disproportional to the triggering fear. You guys ever have one minor thing happen and you just lose it, right? You're overreacting to that trigger. Feeling restless, having trouble with your memory or focusing. Anger, irritability, and aggression. This is common more so in males than females. And just a personal note, I think that's because males are conditioned socially to, omit any other reaction outside of joy and anger. So they might feel more comfortable being angry, irritable when they're really feeling sad or scared. Okay. Having insomnia or frequent nightmares, uncontrollable feelings of panic, fear, or apprehension, and ritualistic behaviors. So maybe asking repeated questions. If you are unsure of the way the scenario is going to play out, you might ask a lot of questions like, well, where are we going? Well, how do we get there? What time does it start, right? You're always asking these constant questions just to kind of satisfy that anxiety. Next, we're going to talk about physical symptoms of anxiety. Some of these you're probably very familiar with. Racing heart or heart palpitations, trembling, hot flashes, headaches or chronic headaches. A lot of times people don't realize that's anxiety. Frequent urination, shortness of breath, feeling nauseous or getting that gut feeling, where it's just all bubbly and feeling uncomfortable. Tense muscles, a lot of chronic pain, especially in your back. Low back pain can be caused by tension or anxiety. Excessive sweating, cold or sweaty hands, and dry mouth. So some of these are going to be more about like if you're having a specific anxiety episode, like that stage fright feeling or something like that. And some of these can be just a consistent like underlying, tone in your life, that you're always feeling this tenseness, you're always feeling this, shortness of breath. Or sometimes if I'm getting in a really anxious space, I forget to breathe, just kind of, I have to stop and take a deep breath, like, okay, I'm fine, I'm breathing. Because our bodies sometimes forget to do the things that it needs to do to stay alive when we're anxious. So we're going to get into some specifics of the most common. Of course, these statistics, again, the purpose that they're serving is to bring to your awareness the normalcy of these disorders, okay? So generalized anxiety disorder, or GAD, affects 6.8 million adults. So do you often find yourself worrying about everyday issues for no obvious reason? Are you always waiting for a disaster to strike or excessively worried about things? kind of par for the course nowadays, though, right? And generalized anxiety disorder can make daily life feel like a constant state of worry, fear, and dread. Okay, so this isn't talking about things that a healthy or a typical nervous system would be anxious about things, like maybe you've got a job interview coming up, or maybe there's a surgery coming up, or something that, it makes sense. It's an obvious reason why you're feeling anxiety. This would just be generally you're anxious, right? No matter what's going on, what kind of day you're having, you just generally have these feelings of anxiety. Okay, that would be a disorder. So some other symptoms would be worrying excessively about everyday things, having trouble controlling your worries or feelings of nervousness. Maybe you know that you worry much more than you should, but you just really can't control it. Feeling restless and having trouble relaxing, having a hard time concentrating. Maybe you startle easily. Maybe you have trouble falling asleep or staying asleep, having headaches, muscle aches, stomach aches, or unexplained pains, a tremble or a twitch, on feeling irritable or on edge all the time, right? You're just waiting for that other shoe to drop, right? So now we're going to talk about social anxiety disorder, or SAD, or SAD. And this affects 15 million adults. And this is United States. This isn't globally. So are you afraid of being judged by others? Are you self-conscious in everyday social situations? Doing everyday things such as eating or drinking in front of others or using a public restroom also may cause anxiety or fear due to concerns about being humiliated, judged, or rejected. And that's really the core of social anxiety disorder, that you feel that in any given situation, over any given activity, you have the potential to be humiliated, judged, or rejected by other people. And they have a fear that the fear that people with social anxiety disorder have in social situations is so intense, you can feel like it's beyond your control. And it may get in the way of doing things like going to work, going to school, or just doing everyday things, right? And you can think other people may be able to accomplish these activities, but they experience a great deal of fear or anxiety when they do. I can attest to that. Once I realized that my anxiety was ruling my life, I would just kind of face that anxiety head on and terrified the whole time, right? But on the outside, it didn't look like I was terrified, but I definitely was. And people with social anxiety disorder may worry about engaging in social situations for weeks before they happen. So if you think, if you've got a wedding, in June, are you already stressing about it? Are you already worried about what people are going to think of you? What are you going to wear? How are you going to act? Okay, that could be a sign of social anxiety disorder. And sometimes you can end up avoiding places or events altogether that cause distress or generate feelings of embarrassment. Okay, so it can be a very life-limiting disorder because you're afraid to just engage in social activities all around. And Suzanne asks, can we get notes for this training? The PowerPoints are usually shared afterward on our website, and so I can definitely link that to you. And I do have some handouts I want to share with anybody who wants them. All right, next. This again, just going to go through some quick stats for common or major types of anxiety. So again, generalized anxiety disorder. It affects 3.1% of the US population, yet only 43.2% are receiving treatment for it. And women are twice as likely to be affected as men. Panic disorder affects 6 million adults, or 2.7% of the population, and women are twice as likely to be affected as men. Social anxiety disorder, 7.1% of the US population, and it's equally common among men and women, and it typically begins around the age of 13. And 36% of people with social anxiety disorder report experiencing symptoms for 10 or more years before seeking help, okay? So again, it's that stigma, I think, that prevents people from seeking the assistance that can really benefit them to move forward with their lives. And then specific phobias affect 19.3 million adults, or 9% of the population. And women are twice as likely to be affected than men. And symptoms will typically begin in childhood, and the average age is about 7 years old when that onset occurs, okay? So now we're going to get into the meat and potatoes of my presentation, and we're going to focus on cognitive distortions. So what is a cognitive distortion? So it's a distorted thought that is an exaggerated pattern of thoughts that is not based on facts. and it can lead you to view things more negatively than they really are. In other words, a cognitive distortion is your mind convincing you to believe negative things about yourself and your world that are not necessarily true. You know, our thoughts have a great impact on how we feel and how we behave. And when we treat negative thoughts as facts, we might see ourselves and act in a way that's based on a faulty assumption. So everyone, of course, will fall into these cognitive distortions on occasion. It's just kind of part of the experience of being a human being, but it can happen particularly when we're feeling down. So if we engage too frequently in negative thoughts, our mental health can take a hit, okay? So here's an example of some common cognitive distortions. So does this sound familiar? Your loved one compliments your love and dedication to visiting them several times. In the end, they make one improvement suggestion, and you leave the visit feeling miserable and dwell on that one suggestion all day. This is what we call filtering. So mental filtering is when we drain and strain all the positives in a situation and dwell on the negatives. So even if there are more positive aspects than negative in a situation or in a person, you focus on the negatives exclusively. Does that sound familiar to anybody? Happens to me a lot, right? Everything in the whole day could be going right, and then one thing goes wrong, and it just, that's all you focus on. That's all you see. And again, that's your nervous system trying to protect you, right? Your nervous system is saying, hey, there's danger right here. Don't fall over there. Don't walk over there. There's danger, danger, danger. And you're not seeing any of the good stuff going on the other side, okay? Another one. Your favorite staff member was a saint until she told you no for one of your requests, and now you cannot stand her. So this is what we call polarization or all or nothing thinking. So polarized thinking is thinking about yourself and the world in an all or nothing way. And all or nothing thinking usually leads to extremely unrealistic standards for yourself and for other people, and that can affect your relationships and your motivation. And black and white thoughts might also set you up for failure, right? So when you engage in thoughts of black and white with no shades of gray, this type of cognitive distortion is leading you. And you all know in life, and especially in caregiving, there has to be shades of gray, right? It cannot be all or nothing. It cannot be binary, right? There has to be nuance to everything, okay? Next, you speak up at a family care plan meeting and your suggestions are not included in the final decision. You leave the meeting thinking, I never say the right thing. So this is what we call overgeneralization. So when we overgeneralize something, we take an isolated negative event and turn it into a never-ending pattern of loss and defeat. So you'll use words like always, never, everything, nothing, right? These are going to be frequent in your train of thoughts. And overgeneralization can also manifest in your thoughts about the world and its events. I'm very guilty of doing this, right? No one ever takes the trash out but me. That's not true. It just seems like I'm always doing it, but I'm not the only one, right? Everything is always terrible all the time. That's not true, right? But we think in these patterns, right? We overgeneralize. That's your anxiety talking, right? That's your anxiety trying to protect you. It's just not doing a very good job, right? All right, next. Your loved one greets you without a smile and they look very serious. Instead of asking how they are, you immediately assume that they're mad at you. This is a cognitive distortion we call jumping to conclusions. So when we jump to conclusions, we interpret an event or a situation negatively without any supporting evidence, okay? Then you react on your assumption. I'm guilty of doing this one as well. A lot of times my husband has a bad day at work, he comes home, he didn't, call me sweetie, baby, cutie, honey, pick me up, smooch me, right? Oh, he hates me now, he wants a divorce. That's not true, right? But we jump to those conclusions, right? We assume that there's something, somebody's not happy with me because of their behavior, okay? And if they hadn't actually said that specifically, or if you can't think of why they would be mad at you, you're probably just jumping to conclusions. There's no evidence to support that conclusion. You're just making that assumption and reacting to that, okay? Next one, your loved one didn't call you this morning. So you think they probably reached for the phone, fell, broke their hip, was stuck on the floor for hours, and they had to have EMT come out to get them, right? This is what we call catastrophizing. So that's related to jumping to conclusions, but in this case, you jump to the worst possible conclusion in every scenario, no matter how improbable that might be. Right? Does that sound familiar? So this cognitive distortion will often come with what if questions, right? What if he didn't call because he got into an accident? Or what if she didn't arrive because she doesn't really want to spend time with me, right? So several questions might follow in response to one event, but the hallmark of this distortion is you're going to jump to the worst possible conclusion. You're going to catastrophize the reasons why, maybe they didn't answer the phone, or maybe they didn't show up for coffee, right? You're just going to assume the worst has happened. So here's the next one. You get irritated with your loved one and think to yourself, I should never feel that way ever. So this is a cognitive distortion that we call shoulds. And that the should statements are subjective, ironclad rules that we set for ourselves and others without considering any specifics of a circumstance. So you tell yourself that things should be a certain way with no exceptions. So when it comes to yourself, you might believe that you should always make your bed, or you should always make people laugh. You should be better, right? You're constantly telling yourself these things. And when they don't happen, when they can really depend on many factors, but you feel guilty, disappointed, let down, or frustrated. I'll often tell my kids, don't should all over yourself, right? Shame lives in should. It really does, because you think you have these rules set up of what it's supposed to be like. And then when you don't meet your own expectations, you feel as if you're inadequate, right? You're defeated, you're disappointed, or let down. Okay. So shoulds are very tricky, I think, in that way. All right, next one. You may firmly believe that something bad will happen today because you woke up feeling anxious. This is what we call emotional reasoning. And this can lead us to believe that the way we feel is a reflection of reality. And I'm here to tell you that's not always the case, and thank goodness, because sometimes I feel the worst about a situation that's really not that bad. Okay, we emotionally reason our responses. So it'll be like, I feel this way about the situation, so it must be a fact. That is what defines this cognitive distortion. And it might also lead you to believe that future events depend on how you feel. So you might also assess a random situation based on your emotional reaction, okay? And if you think about that, if your emotional reaction or your perception about something is distorted, and then you reason your behavior or your response to that through the emotions that are not based on fact, you can see how that knot gets tangled up pretty quickly, right? So you just acknowledging these different patterns can be very helpful to prevent that tangling. All right, you bring your loved one a new article of clothing and they don't say thank you. So you just know that they hate it. This is what we call mind reading. So when people assume that they know what others are thinking, they're resorting to mind reading. And this cognitive delusion or distortion, you may also assume that others are thinking negative thoughts about you. Does that ever happen to anybody? So the best way is to combat this is we consider all the evidence, not just evidence that confirms our suspicions or beliefs, okay? So maybe they didn't like that shirt or whatever that you brought them. Maybe they're just kind of feeling tired. Maybe they don't feel well. Maybe they just maybe missed the opportunity to say thank you and it wasn't even that big of a deal to them, but then you've made it a big deal, right? Honestly, if they did hate it, is that really the end of the world? Side note, probably not, right? All right, and the last one. You want your loved one to smile big and hug you when you come to see them, despite them never showing much emotion or ever really being that affectionate. So every time you see them, you let them know how upset you are for not smiling and hugging. And eventually, they will change their ways and want to hug and kiss you upon arrival. This is what we call the fallacy of change. And that has you expecting other people will change their ways to suit your expectations or your needs, particularly when you pressure them enough. So has that ever happened to you, where you think someone should be behaving in a certain way and they don't? And so you just think, well, if I pester them, or if I keep bringing it up, okay? Sometimes that's not the case, right? And that's sometimes when we start getting into some of these very toxic relationship patterns, right? Where we want to try to change somebody instead of working on ourselves. So maybe you saw some of yourselves in those examples. Maybe you saw some of your loved ones that you're caring for in those examples. But how do we change these cognitive distortions, right? And the good thing about the human brain is we all have the capacity for change, right? We all have neuroplasticity. We can all change behaviors once we recognize them. And that's the first step. We need to identify that troublesome thought. So when we realize the thought is causing anxiety or it's dampening our moods, a good first step is to figure out what kind of distorted thinking is taking place. Am I catastrophizing? Am I jumping to conclusions? Am I trying to do a fallacy of change here and get somebody to do what I want them to do, right? So identifying that thought is the first step in changing that distortion. So we can try reframing the thought. So if you've ever even just scratched the surface of therapeutic help, you've probably heard the term reframing. And that really is just about looking at things from a different perspective, right? So we're looking for shades of gray, alternative explanations, and objective evidence, positive interpretations to expand our thinking. So we might find it helpful to write down our original thought, followed by 3 or 4 alternative interpretations, right? Maybe my husband didn't greet me with a smile when he got home from work because he just had a bad day, or his head hurts, or he has to rush to the bathroom, right? It doesn't necessarily mean he's mad at me, right? So thinking of other explanations for behaviors and reframing that thought. Next, we can perform a cost-benefit analysis. This is also known as a pros and cons list, right? So we will typically repeat behaviors that deliver some benefit to us. And you might be thinking, what benefit does having distorted thinking serve, right? What does that give me? But we can figure that out by analyzing how our past our thought patterns have helped us cope in the past, right? So I'll give you an example of myself. There were several times where my husband would come in from a long day at work, had a bad day, stressed out. It wasn't me that was the problem, but I assumed it was me. And so I immediately jumped into a fawning response. I immediately jumped into making him feel good and feel comfortable so that I knew he was pleased with me, right? Not that he didn't appreciate that, right? But I was spending a lot of energy trying to manage his reaction to me that was completely made up. Okay, I hope that made sense. And maybe you can see a little bit yourself in that example. So do these cognitive distortions give us a sense of control in situations where we feel powerless, right? Do they allow us to avoid taking responsibility or necessary risks for change? And we can also ask ourselves what engaging in this distortion is going to cost you, right? Weighing the pros and cons of our thought patterns can motivate us to change them. So in the example I gave you, the cost of doing that was my emotional energy, right? Me stressing out and worrying. What am I trying to figure out? What did I do wrong? How can I fix this, right? And he's over there eating dinner, not even minding. He don't know what's going on in my brain. I'm the one spend all this energy and stressing out. And it was unnecessary, right? So that was a big cost. Next, you can consider cognitive behavioral therapy. So CBT is a widely recognized form of talk therapy in which you can learn to identify, interrupt, and change these unhealthy thinking patterns. So if you'd like some guidance in identifying and changing these thinking patterns, you could probably find this therapy pretty useful. What it is basically it focuses on specific goals. So if you say, I want to be less of a people pleaser, I want to be less anxious, I want to be less, of a jumping to conclusions kind of person, okay? You tell your therapist that these are the goals that you want to reach. And it'll generally take place for a predetermined number of sessions and might take a few weeks or maybe even just a few months to see any results, right? So we want to look for a therapist who's properly certified and licensed in the state that you're going to be doing that therapy in. And they should be trained in CBT. Okay, not every therapist is, but many of them are. So what else can you do? You can replace absolutes. So once you focus on your thoughts and recognize a pattern, consider replacing statements such as always and nothing with sometimes and this. So the example I gave you before when I said, I'm always the only one that takes out the trash. No, I can say this time I'm taking out the trash, right? Sometimes I have to take out the trash because that's more accurate, right? So just replacing that one word can really make a difference. It makes it not an absolute. It doesn't solidify that in your brain of this is the way it's always going to be, right? Defining yourself and others. So this is really important. We try labeling the behavior instead of labeling ourselves. So instead of labeling yourself lazy because you didn't clean today, you can consider, I just didn't clean today, right? That one action doesn't define you. You're not lazy because you took a day off, okay? So identifying the behavior and not labeling ourselves is very helpful in unlocking these patterns or escaping these patterns, I should say. Got some stuff in the chat. I'm gonna check real quick. All right, nail on the head. Good, good, good. All right, just make sure there's no questions. Let's see. Come on, there we go. So what else can we do? We can search for positive aspects. So even if it's challenging at first, which I'm here to promise you it absolutely will be, it absolutely will be. What if we could find at least 3 positive examples in every situation? It might not feel natural, but eventually it may become a spontaneous habit, okay? I'm a benefactor of this behavior, right? Because I would speak in those absolutes. It's always this way. It's never going to not be this way, right? But then again, that reframing and looking at positive aspects, it is a very habitual thing for me. I will often look on the sunny side where it wasn't always like that. It took me a couple years to get to that space. So it definitely is possible. And then we can consider, does the evidence back up our negative thinking? So before making conclusions, consider asking, investigating, and questioning ourselves and others to ensure you have as many facts as possible. And if you can, make an extra effort to believe these facts. So I'll do this with my teenagers if they come to me with some, distorted impression of themselves, right? Oh, I'm not this enough. I'm not that enough, right? Who told you that? Where did you learn that? Right? Because sometimes, again, our inner critic, our inner voice, our inner self will tell us things with the intention of protecting us, but it can be very distorted and it doesn't protect us and it makes things worse. And so stopping those thoughts and thinking, what evidence do I have to support this way of thinking? You're more than likely going to find out that you don't have a whole lot of evidence, right? You're jumping to conclusions, you're making assumptions, right? You're mind reading. Write our thoughts down. Now, I've told you this a million times, how wonderful journaling is. And I've also admitted to you that I'm horrible at doing it, but it does help, okay? So keeping a journal or writing down our thoughts when we're anxious is very simple and it's a very effective way to reduce worry. Writing about caregiving emotions in particular, like anxiety, can reduce the intensity of those feelings. Getting the thoughts out of our heads and down on paper can help us to feel calmer and less stressed. You're giving it somewhere else to live besides your brain, besides your ruminating brain, right? And seeing our thoughts on paper can give us a different perspective, right? And that can often make it easier to recognize and change unhealthy thought patterns like distorted thinking, okay? So some more benefits of journaling. You can help you find solutions to tough challenges. Writing out our thoughts help us connect the dots and come up with solutions that we would not have otherwise thought of. So next time you're up against a sticky caregiving challenge, try writing about what's going on. It could help you think of a creative way to solve the problem. Journaling can make your caregiving easier because writing things down will help you to see patterns, right? It's a way for us to know ourselves. It gives us the ability to spot things that could be improved, that can be simplified or eliminated just to make things run more smoothly. So maybe you'll start to notice that mom gets upset every time you talk about leaving the house, but doesn't make a fuss if you just leave, right? So you can be like, well, I'll just stop talking about leaving. Then she won't get so upset. Or maybe you'll find out that your spouse is much more willing to bathe during the early afternoon than in the evening, right? So it's just a way for you to keep track of what's happening so you can see these patterns. And writing about fights or misunderstanding can help us keep from stewing it over in our mind. And it might even help us to see another person's point of view and figure out a way to resolve the conflict, okay? Staying grateful and positive is another way that we can change cognitive distortions. So looking for and reminding ourselves of the positive things will actually limit the negativity and it'll help us rein in those out of control thoughts, okay? So it's like what you feed will thrive, and what you starve will die, right? So if you're constantly feeding these out of control thoughts, these distorted thinking patterns, they're going to continue to grow bigger and bigger and bigger in your mind. Okay. So to be clear though, being grateful or positive doesn't mean that we ignore our negative feelings. Okay. Ignoring feelings is never the way to go. And I would never advise that. We always want to process through them, feel those feelings. Okay. But it doesn't mean we're supposed to be thankful no matter what or how hard caregiving gets, because sometimes it's really hard to be grateful in hard situations. But gratitude is about noticing that there's always something positive in your life, no matter how dark things may seem. So maybe that incident or that event was, a bummer, not good, but that doesn't have to encompass your whole day or your whole identity. Okay. So being aware of that will help us to get to a different perspective and see that things are not 100% terrible all the time. So keeping a gratitude journal or gratitude calendar can be helpful. And there's also 10 or 21 day kind of gratitude challenges you can find online. Maybe just challenge yourself in that way and see how far you can get and see if it makes a difference. Talking nicely to ourselves. This one is huge, 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 huge. We all have an inner critic, right? We all have that inner saboteur that will tell us all the horrible things that could possibly go wrong, right? And all the horrible things about ourselves. But if we talk to ourselves in a positive way, that's a way to combat that, stop that thinking pattern in the track. So it's basically that voice that's always in your head, and it happens without you even noticing it, and it can be positive or negative. So speaking to ourselves in a positive, supportive way is a lot more pleasant and calming than that steady stream of negativity. And sometimes we don't even realize how mean we're being to ourselves until we stop and think about it, right? So to reduce anxiety, work on decreasing the amount and intensity of negative self-talk while increasing positive self-talk. So it might help you to think about how you would speak with a close friend or family member. You would be supportive and kind, right? You wouldn't berate them or discourage them. So treat yourself in that same positive way, okay? The things you're saying to yourself, you would never say out loud to somebody that you care about. You probably shouldn't be saying it to yourself. So I just want to include this little activity. And again, if you're interested, when I send the surveys out, I will send a link to some of these PDFs so that you can, peruse them at your leisure and see if there's something that is useful for you. So this is a very simple one. It's called the Silver Linings Positive Psychology Exercise. And in difficult situations, it's possible to focus on the negative or look for the positive. Research shows that finding the silver linings of challenging situations can help us become happier and more optimistic. The more you practice finding silver linings, the better you'll get. So you can complete this exercise every day for a couple weeks, and then of course regularly as it benefits you. The first one is just list 5 things that make your life enjoyable. That could be general, like your health or feeling the sunshine on your skin, right? That'll help you get a positive mindset. Step 2, briefly describe the most recent time something didn't go your way or you felt upset or frustrated. And step 3 is spend some time reflecting on the silver linings from that situation and describe 3 of them. So this is just a good way to kind of give you that framework or that template on how you can kind of stop these distortions in their tracks, right? And find that silver lining and find that positive spin, right? Reframing. Okay, that's an exercise that you can use. Okay, Crystal, I'll send those to you. Next, acknowledge your strengths. I think we all struggle with this, right? You ever been to a job interview and they say, well, what's, name one of your strengths? And you're like, I don't know. I drive well. I don't know, but we have a lot of strengths we don't give ourselves credit for. So listing our strengths, again, pen to paper, or text to type or whatever you want to call it. This is a good way for us to kind of sort through some of these thoughts in our mind and really see what resources, what skills we have to our disposal that are an advantage to us. So we can list our strengths, describe how we use our strengths in everyday life, and describe how we've used our strengths to overcome a specific challenge. Sometimes You know, having that mountaintop moment where we look back and see how far we've actually come can be a huge boon to our confidence, right? Because sometimes you're so deep in the trenches, you're so covered in the muck, you don't realize the journey you've been on and how far you've come already. And so stopping and taking a moment to really reflect can be a great way for us to build confidence in ourselves. So here's just an example of some strengths. Wisdom, artistic ability, curiosity, leadership, empathy, right? That's a big one. Not everybody has strong empathy. Honesty, open-minded, persistent, right? Ambitious. Maybe your spirituality is your strength. Maybe your sense of humor is your strength. You're intelligent, you have discipline, you have logic, right? You're optimistic, right? So it doesn't have to necessarily be like a textbook strength or talent, right? Just common sense, self-control. These are all strengths that you have that I'm sure you've all used in your caregiving journey because it's just absolutely necessary sometimes, right? To be flexible or to be kind, right? So that's a good activity you can do on your own as well. Now we're going to switch over to the fear of disappointing others. If you heard of FOMO, the fear of missing out, well, here's FODO, the fear of disappointing others. So often chronic stress, anxiety, and overwhelm, and even burnout are driven primarily by this fear of disappointing other people. A lot of people who struggle with chronic stress and burnout have a hard time setting boundaries. We talked about boundaries last week, I believe, and if you're interested, I can link you to the training for that. So you're stressed out basically because you can't say no. And you're unwilling to say no because you're afraid that somebody will be disappointed with you. So that means if you want to deal with your chronic stress or your chronic anxiety or your burnout or your overwhelm, you have to deal with the root cause, which in many cases is actually a hidden fear of disappointing other people or people pleasing. So how many times have you said yes to something you really wanted to say no to because you didn't want somebody to be disappointed in you? You didn't want somebody to be mad at you, right? So there's really only one way to get over this. You have to face it repeatedly and willingly. This is when people say you've got to do the work. This is the work, right? So that means that if you want to get over your excessive fear of disappointing others, you have to be willing to do the thing that might lead them to feeling disappointed, right? And that's hard. That's hard for some of us. So we can consider the cost of our photo, right? This is another way, just kind of breaking it down and see if it's really worth the energy we're putting into it. So we need to remind ourselves the costs and consequences of never saying no. All the emotional energy that we're spending worrying and stressing over this decision is energy that we now don't have to be present and emotionally available in other important needs of our life, right? Because you just exhausted all your emotional resources by trying to people please. So in other words, there are emotional opportunity costs to our fear of disappointing others and avoiding facing up to that fear. So we need to make sure that we approach this from a place of self-compassion and not self-criticism. Okay, it's very important. We acknowledge these unhealthy thinking patterns and we give ourselves compassion, not criticism, while we change. Okay, we're relearning. We don't criticize a baby for learning to walk when they fall over. This is the same thing. We don't criticize ourselves for learning to do this new dance, okay? Remember that you are not responsible for other people's emotions. Yikes, this is a huge one, right? Especially if you're caregiving for somebody because you know you are the end all be all in a lot of their lives, right? So it's very easy to fall into this pattern of thinking that we're responsible for their emotions, but we are not, right? We cannot be held responsible for things that we can't control. We cannot control how other people feel. So to put this in perspective, we wouldn't blame someone for being short or for having brown eyes, right? Because there's nothing morally wrong with having brown eyes or being short, and they have no control over it. So similarly, whether someone else feels disappointed in you might be unfortunate. It's neither morally wrong nor something you have direct control over. Okay, disappointing somebody is not morally wrong. Okay, you're not going to have the heavens open up and shoot you with a lightning bolt because somebody's disappointed in you. All that means is they had expectations of your behavior that you didn't meet, and that's a them problem, right? So how we feel is a result of how we think, which means other people's emotions are their responsibility, not ours. Okay? We are responsible for our actions, but not other people's feelings. So of course you do have a responsibility to behave well because your behavior is something that you can control, right? But how another person interprets and feels about your behavior isn't something you can control. So it's not something that you can judge as right or wrong or good or bad. Okay, it just is. And if you've lived any amount of time on this planet, you know that disappointing others is just part of the course, right? If you're gonna live a life that's authentic to you and meets your needs and serves the purpose for you, that's really all you have control over, right? Not other people's response to that. Next, reframe our fear as uncomfortable and not dangerous. So remember, that anxiety is telling you to be afraid of something to protect you, but not everything we fear is dangerous, right? So emotions like fear and anxiety are uncomfortable and sometimes they are even painful, but they're not dangerous. Those feelings are not dangerous in and of themselves. So one reason we have such a hard time facing our fears is because our tolerance for fear itself is pretty low. And it's low because we mistakenly assume that because fear and anxiety feel bad, they are bad. But that's not necessarily true, right? And we tend to avoid them because we think they're bad. So if we're going to get over our fear of disappointing other people, we're going to have to face that fear head on. Have you heard the definition of courage is not the absence of fear, but the presence of action despite the fear, right? Face it head on. So you're going to have to willingly feel afraid and tolerate that feeling for a while. So remember, just because it feels bad doesn't mean it is bad. And a lot of us feel it feels bad to tell somebody no. It feels bad to disappoint them, but that doesn't mean it is bad. So we can reframe our fear as uncomfortable but not dangerous, and it's going to make it a little more likely that we'll be able to tolerate that instead of impulsively trying to avoid it, right? And again, self-care. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this because I feel like, we're preaching to the choir here, but our mental wellness and emotional resiliency factor a lot of the self-care things factor into that. Getting enough sleep, staying active, and eating right. Okay. If you eat a lot of really junky food that's not good for your body, that's not going to give you any nutritional value, that can bring your mood down. Okay. I know doctors have even started calling your gut like your second brain because if your gut's not happy, you're not happy. Okay. So just be mindful of what we're consuming and getting enough sleep and all that. Don't go it alone, right? Get support. So feeling like you're alone in a difficult situation will intensify anxious feelings and anxious thinking. So talking to other people in a similar situation gives the relief of knowing that what you're going through is normal and that you're not the only one with these feelings. That's why trainings like this and support groups are so, so important, because when you know you're not alone, right? There's millions of people on the planet who are feeling the same way you're feeling. It kind of alleviates that anxiousness a little bit, right? So some ways that we can reach out for support when we're anxious or stressed is we can talk to fellow caregivers, right? At a support group, in person, online, or both. You can call an understanding friend and vent your frustrations. You can speak with a trained counselor and learn coping tips, and feel free to say anything, right? Or we can talk with a trusted religious or spiritual leader. And just as a side note, if you aren't aware, which I think most of you are, I am also available for care chats, right? If you're feeling that spin up, you can call me. I will be here, at least until 4:30. All right, and good mental health. So according to the research, good mental health is vital at every stage of life, helping us manage stress, relate to others, and make positive choices in line with our values. It's intimately connected with our physical health. One affects the other. So poor mental health, as indicated by depression and long-term anxiety, can be a factor in many severe chronic health conditions, such as heart disease, diabetes, and strokes. So of course, maintaining good mental health can have a protective effect on our overall health. And it can increase our feelings of calm, happiness, satisfaction, and the sense that we have a fulfilling life. So positive emotions lead to an increasing upward spiral of flourishing. And finally, here are some mobile apps that are free for the most part that can relieve caregiver anxiety. And I can send these to you as well if you're interested. So there's What's Up. It's a great all-around app with a wealth of helpful anxiety and stress management tools that are perfect for caregivers. So they have 4 tools in the Help Right Now section for instant relief. using different techniques to help you stop those negative thoughts and regain your calm. Next, Mind Shift CBT. When you need fast anxiety relief, Mind Shift helps you take a breath, shift your thinking, and take steps to cope. So they have guided meditations, coping cards, um, thoughtful journaling prompts, things like that to kind of help you establish those patterns, or not establish, but acknowledge those patterns, see those patterns, okay? Another one, Stop Panic and Anxiety Self-Help. That is an app specifically designed to help with panic attacks, which some of you may experience. 7 Cups connects you to a 24/7 free emotional support with their anonymous free chat feature. So maybe you don't have anyone that you feel comfortable talking to face to face. Maybe you feel like you don't want to have your friends shoulder any of your stress or anxiety. You can call 7 Cups or use the app and have that anonymous support. They also have a free self-help guide that cover a range of mental health topics. And then they also offer affordable online therapy for a low monthly fee. So that could be useful for some of us. Next is the Insight Timer. So that is a completely free app for sleep, anxiety, and stress. It offers guided meditations, courses, insightful talks, and more. And they have dozens of meditations specifically for anxiety. So these are just a few examples. There's, way more than this on the internet, in the App Store. You can find support groups online. You can find support groups through Facebook. There's a lot of resources available to where you realize that you don't have to do this alone. You can get the support, even if it's just somebody saying, I hear you, I've been there, right? That can make a world of difference. So that's the information I have for you today. I'll go ahead and stop sharing. We've got a few minutes to have a discussion if you're interested. I will stop the recording.